Thanks a lot. So I'm just going to talk a bit about more of the organizational approach. What are the administrations and the policymakers and the executives doing about all of this to date? I'll talk a little bit about the organization I work with, CIFFC, and then a little bit about the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy that you heard referred to a couple times today. Some of the resource sharing challenges we have in Canada, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers and Wildfire Management Working Group and their work plans, and then a little bit about looking ahead and what the next steps may be. So who is CIFFC? It's the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre. It's a not-for-profit federally registered corporation, but we're owned and operated by the federal government, 10 provinces and 2 of the territories. The territory of Nunavut does not have a wildfire program and therefore is not a member of CIFFC. So its level of governance, the highest level is the Board of Trustees, which are made up of the Assistant Deputy Ministers from 13 jurisdictions. It does the strategic planning, financial approvals for the corporation, and it also has the approval of a resource exchange fund, which was created in 2004 for projects in wildfire management. Also, the second level of governance is the Council of Directors, which are your wildland fire directors. You heard Peter speak this morning, retired from British Columbia, and he was a member of that board along with some of the others. And they meet regularly to share ideas and enhance the national plan for cooperation. We have a coordination center in Winnipeg, and there's 6 people work there. So that's our main focus, is to exchange resources between the agencies in Canada. But also we have a project and a work delivery framework. We have working groups and communities of practice. You heard Adam speak this afternoon. He's chair of one of those communities of practice, which is a wildfire prevention. And then we also have task teams, either ad hoc or when needed under certain tasks. And then we have international collaboration. CIFFC, we belong to the International Liaison Committee, which is put together under the UN, under the FAO. We're also part of the North American Forestry Commission's Fire Management Working Group, and we work with the Global Fire Monitoring Center in Germany, again under the FAO and the United Nations. Our legal framework, we have an operational agreement, and of course as a corporation we have corporate bylaws, and then we have a mutual aid resource sharing agreement, commonly known as the MARS, that was put together in 1982, when, by the way, this corporation, CIFFC, was formed in 1982. It's 30 years old. And the MARS, the implementation guidelines under that, and this is what allows the 10 provinces and the 2 territories in the federal government to come together in Canada and have a framework where they can share resources and help one another out when needed. So the implementation guidelines, they establish protocols to request, receive, and return resources. They establish the rates and cost recovery mechanisms. So when Peter talked this morning about the amount of resources that were in BC in 2003, or last year the amount of resources that were moved, prior to those resources being moved, everything was set in place in terms of what it would cost, what the rules were around the loan, the move, and when they had to be returned and that kind of thing. And then there's annual agreement on all of this prior to the fire season from all the agencies. And then again, as I mentioned, there's various international agreements. The Canada-US reciprocal agreement was also developed in 1982 when this corporation was formed, and it has been used every year but one in all that time. So every year we do some kind of exchange with the US. And we're also working on some other agreements with other countries. Last year we had 6 aircraft in the US, and somebody mentioned this morning the fires in Texas, and so there were Canadian aircraft working on those fires as well as some others. We also have agreements with New Zealand. I was just in Mexico last week to sign a letter of intent. We will be signing an agreement with Mexico in May in Quebec City, and we are working with Australia to sign an agreement with them. So the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy was commissioned by the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers following a series of severe fires, but culminating in the disastrous fire in 2003 in BC, in which Peter talked about this morning. The Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy was published in 2005, and it outlined a 10-year program to strengthen the fire management in Canada and deal with some of the issues such as the increasing risk in the wildland-urban interface, which you heard talked about today, the competing demands on the forest lands and resources, the increasing values of risk, the climate change, of course, and the aging fire management infrastructure. In 2005, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers committed to a 10-year, roughly $2 billion investment plan to implement the strategy with a 50-50 cost sharing between the federal and provincial territorial governments. So since then, Canada's wildland fire agencies have worked collectively and individually to implement key aspects of the strategy, but the funding levels envisioned in the strategy have never been achieved. So people are getting together and they're trying to do what they can, but the funding isn't there. Meanwhile, the severe fire seasons, property losses, climatic and fire season variability, and resource constraints continue to challenges. So we heard Peter talk about BC. We know what went on last year in Alberta, Northern Ontario last year, and also the Halifax regional municipalities in the last few years. And a couple of people today mentioned, both Mike and Peter talked about impact, and the reason I put HRM in there, the Halifax regional municipality, in 2010 when I was in Saskatchewan, we had a fire that burned 500,000 hectares, but it had very little of any impact. But in Nova Scotia in, I forget the year, but it was 2009, there was a Spryfield fire in the Halifax regional municipality. And they had 1,000 residents that had to flee their homes, and they lost 12 homes, and it was only a 600-hectare fire. So it's all about impact in some of these cases. A little bit more about some of the sharing challenges here, and I've got these graphs from Brian Stocks, but it is just to show that the three most active agencies in resource exchange in the past decade, British Columbia has certainly been an importer, and Ontario has been an exporter in the last decade. I think prior to the last decade it would look differently for Ontario, and then Alberta's kind of been a wash, they've been a break even. So the challenge is that no single agency can sufficiently have its resources for its times of escalated fire activity. So no province or territory can hold enough resources to deal with the escalated activity. But Canada's wildland fire management agencies are dependent on this cooperative system of mutual aid resource sharing, which is why this corporation, CIFFC, came to being, and why they're doing all this other work. So the increasing fire load and resource capacity issues are challenging our ability to meet the ongoing need for the resource sharing. So clearly everything you've heard today, at the end of the day, to the deliverers of these programs means that the increasing load and the resource capacity issues are a huge challenge. So in 2010, the CCEFM, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, commissioned a resource sharing study. And I just want to say, quickly that and I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, but I'll say it anyway, I've never been scared of that before, but when it comes to firefighters and fire attack and initial attack, if I just said in this room, who's the best? Well, Peter would yell out BC, and Adam would yell out Alberta, and Al would yell out Parks Canada. And then internationally, as I sit around tables, it would be the same thing. The US would put their hand up, and Canada would put their hand up. But if I was asked to, and of course a lot of that's ego-driven too, that's where I get in trouble. But if I was asked to pick from that international group who were the best firefighters, I would look for the exit and slip out the door because I wouldn't have an answer to that. But when it comes to fire science, it's clear beyond a shadow of a doubt globally that Canada is a leader in fire science and research, and has been. And the only thing that affects that to date is lack of funding. But our history and our respect around the globe for fire science and research is second to none. So what I wanted to say about that is that in 2010, when the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers commissioned a resource sharing study, they went to some of the science group, and Brian Stocks is here in the room, and he's one of the great giant brains in Canada of fire science, and a lot of people lean on him, but that's who the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers went to and commissioned the study. So in Brian's report, he made a few recommendations, and some were address the operational and institutional barriers to greater levels of resource sharing, And expand the use of international resource sharing partnerships. So besides what we have and what agreements we have, across Canada there are 3 international compacts with the United States. There's the Northwest, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast. And every province and territory in Canada that has a wildfire program, with the exception of Prince Edward Island, is a member of one of those compacts. So Brian recommended that we find a better way to use those. Also, to develop improved tools for forecasting fire load and assessing the demand for and availability of resources. Develop a more strategic approach to resource sharing with better strategic planning tools and improved approaches to risk management. And remember that in Canada, each province and territory is 100% responsible for their own forest fire management. So there is no federal presence in terms of firefighting other than Parks Canada. But there is no, in the U.S., the U.S. Forest Service has resources, controls resources, makes decisions around resources. There isn't that entity in Canada. It's up to each province and territory. So Brian is saying to develop a more strategic approach to how you share your resources and how you make them available. And then communicate to politicians and the public the risk associated with increasing fire load and static or declining fire management capacities. So when are we hitting the wall? How do we know that? And what are we going to do about it? And, for instance, last year from CIFFC's point of view, when Alberta, we talked about Slave Lake, when Slave Lake were busy, they were the only show in Canada. No one else was busy from a fire management point of view. Had any one province had increased activity, we didn't know where we were going for resources. The U.S. had said, don't call, we can't come, we're busy. And Australia, it was wintertime, their people were laid off. So just to give you an idea, that was very busy for Alberta, but they were the only show in Canada. Nobody else was fighting fire. And thank God for that, because we would have been in a mess. So then the Wildland Fire Management Working Group were formed as a group under the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. And they're to provide policy and strategic advice for improving wildland fire management in Canada, and to be the keepers of, we talked about earlier, the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy. Because prior to this group, the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy got developed under CIFFC, then it was kind of floating around, and it didn't have a home for a while. So the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers realized it needed a home, so they created this group. And the Wildfire Management Working Group is made up of ADM level representation. And again, they're from the federal government and from the provincial territorial representatives that have a wildland fire program. And again, Nunavut is the only one that isn't. So how does the Wildfire Management Working Group and CIFFC come together? There's 2 sides of the coin. CIFFC is focused on coordinating effective mutual aid resource sharing and the information exchange among the Canadian agencies. So really we're an operational and a tactical focus, both within Canada and internationally. But then the Wildfire Management Working Group has a mandate for fire management strategy and policy across Canada. So what is the strategy? What are we looking at in the future? But both groups have the shared objective of ensuring agencies have the most effective preparedness and response capabilities possible. So it's the same players, all have skin in the game, but they're just kind of their focus. One's strategic, one's operational and tactical. So they've developed a working partnership with very mutual benefits. The Wildfire Management Working Groups works with the CIFFC working groups, and you heard Adam speak about that earlier. The CIFFC Wildfire Prevention Working Group is their main reason for being and their main focus right now is to deal with the Wildfire Management Working Group working plan and how that can be implemented across Canada. So there's mutual benefit in that from taking advantage of the synergies, because again, they're the same people. They're paid by the same agencies, and they can get the work done. The Wildfire Management Working Group funding will support both his work plan and enhance the CIFFC resources. So CIFFC has the groups under its owners. They have the people, and then the CCFM and the Wildfire Management Working Group can bring the funding to help get the projects delivered. So what are these projects and what do they have underway? So in conjunction, there's been 3 task teams drawn from the CIFFC organization, meaning it's not just the center in Winnipeg, but the 10 provinces, 2 territories, and the federal government. And they're working on 3 strategic elements. One is they're addressing the issue of increasing fire load and resource capacity challenges, and they're developing a multi-agency approach to community protection from wildfires, and that's what Adam talked about. And then they're developing a coordinated fuels management strategy. And significant progress has been made to date. It's a huge commitment. It's a huge commitment from these agencies, and they're just starting to realize that now, how big of a commitment it is for each of the provinces and the territories. But it's big picture thinking, so they're continuing on because, you know, each one of these people that are involved. Adam talked here today about a national program, about national delivery, but Adam has a day job in Alberta, and he's responsible to that group. But his supervisors have made him available to deliver this program because it's big picture thinking. It's thinking about the Canadian picture and not just Alberta's. So what are they doing? A national survey of recent and expected future trends in fire load and resource capacity is underway. And the barriers and enhancement to increase resource sharing capability are being identified. So they're, along with the groups, there's a couple of consultants that have been hired to help do some of these surveys and gather up some information. And then we want to develop a strategy to expand the FireSmart initiatives to all interested agencies. So what Adam talked about and what Kelly talked about in terms of the FireSmart, if you're interested as an agency, then there's a strategy on how to do that. How do we expand it? So, and in partnership with the Partners in Protection, a series of FireSmart community workshops are being delivered, and Kelly and Adam talked about that. And then a full-day workshop will be held at the Wildland Fire Canada Conference in Kananaskis this fall. A national survey on the state of hazardous fuels and the implementation of fuels management programs is underway, and a compilation of best fuels management practices, policies, and strategies to communicate these to agencies and partners are being developed. Partnerships with research and operational agencies to further develop cost-effective fuel treatment alternatives are being pursued. So there's a task team that is working on nothing but the fuels and what can be done with those. So those are the 3 areas: the resource capacity, the fuels, and the FireSmart communities that they're working on right now. But what are the next steps? Well, the Wildfire Management Working Group has said, okay, this is going well, and it is going well. And they've submitted a draft 2012-13 work plan to the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers for approval. And it proposes to continue the same partnership that we have now with CIFFC and its member agencies, and building the basis for a comprehensive national wildfire response plan. So at the end of the day, we need a comprehensive national wildfire response plan to help deal with all of the aspects in Brian Stock's report and recommendation. But we have to start somewhere. We have to start and gather the basic information. So what I talked to you about that they've done to date is the start of that, and now we're going into the next step to how do we bring the next stage? How do we strategically move from gathering the raw data to storage, to accessibility, to building a comprehensive national wildland response plan. And the work will continue in the 3 main areas that I mentioned, so in the resource capacity, the fuels, and the resilient communities, or the FireSmart communities. But further development of information and decision support systems for improving forecasting of resource demand and analysis of resource sharing options. So one of the things that we've talked about, and one of the things we've been working on from a strategic point of view, is that we have lots of information. We have lots of information flowing around, but some of it flows around within the walls of the provincial or territorial borders. Some of it comes to the federal level. Some of it comes to Natural Resources Canada and the Northern Forestry Centre in Edmonton, Alberta. Some of it comes to CIFFC. And again, it just all kinds of beats off the walls or gets in a box and gets put on a shelf. We want a strategic and comprehensive approach to information, and our future is, or our vision for the future is that every jurisdiction will have one point of entry for data, and then every one of the agencies involved will have access to all of that data, and to be able to mine and create reports at will with all of the available information. And we've never, and I'm working very closely with the Canadian Forest Service on this, and their information manager and his staff, and they've committed 100% to this vision. So we're all on the same page now, and as he said, we've probably never in our history have been in a time where, number one, we all wanted this vision so collectively, and number two, the tools are out there in terms of information technology to bring all this together. So we've always had the information, we've always had the paper, but we've never been at a state in time where we've been able to bring this vision I talked to you about of one point of entry of data, and then collectively it's available to all the members at any time to mine how they see fit. So it's an exciting time, and I think there's a great future for this vision I just mentioned. And then also developing approaches to measuring resource sharing effectiveness and assessing and managing risk in Canada's resource sharing system. So when are we at the wall? How are decisions made? So when Peter was director in BC and if Ontario was burning down and we called him up and said, we need your help, how did he make those decisions? When did Peter know that he was up against the wall and he was starting to jeopardize the safety of the public of British Columbia, or when was it okay to share resources? We need a more comprehensive system, something that's science-based and can help make the decisions on those things. So that's where we're headed into the future with some of this work. So there is a lot happening right now, and most of it has been started with, again, the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy. That kind of died off, now it's back. The report from Brian Stocks to say this is what you need to do, and a lot of people are taking it serious now, and there's a lot of work happening at a strategic level. And that's it.
Yes, Kim. I have a comment to make around the fact that it's well recognized that the Canadian Wildland Fire Agency is doing an outstanding job. There's no question about that. However, those agencies are only responsible for the forested areas in most cases. And in many cases across Canada, and I know for a fact in Alberta, that's only 2/3 of the province. And I believe that there's a missing piece here, and that's the rest of the real estate out there and the organizations that are responsible there. In fact, I would even put to you that the statistics are skewed that are thrown around, because for most cases that is simply forest fire statistics, not real wildland statistics across the country. Is there any movement towards bringing the missing piece of the puzzle together? In other words, the municipal structural jurisdictions as well as the forest area?
And Kelly, just so I'm clear, are you asking just about the data and the collection, or are you actually asking about the operational side of that as well?
That's the whole thing.
Okay. Not to my knowledge. I haven't heard at the ADM level or the director's level any discussion in what you just talked about, in that as being a missing link and how we should maybe bring that together. But it's a very valid and good point.
That's one of the things that we're trying to do with partners protection.
Be all inclusive.
Exactly.
Understood.
Thanks for the presentation, Kim. Very good. Just a question I'm sure you anticipated from me. Can you talk a little bit more about what you see being in the National Response Plan?
Yeah, I mean, the National Response Plan is desired by the agencies, it's desired by the community to help. Its design will be to help create a national approach to fire suppression, as opposed to individual or provincial territorial. And so in that plan, it will have tools on what resources are available across Canada at any given time, not just a once-a-year collection of data, and what levels are considered critical in terms of loaning resources, when an agency can loan resources, what is available and what cannot be available. I don't know, Peter.
Well, I guess what I had envisioned in a National Response Plan in 2003, when we called up the military, we actually ended up with about 2,700 resources showing up. And I'm just wondering, given the military commitment, if there's any thought to approaching them for further commitment on what they might do in the future, or thinking about what might be used to fill the gap if they're not available. Just as one example of a key resource that we've had access to in the past.
Right, so when we're in critical shape and we're out of Canadian resources, where we go next, that type of issue. Yeah, that'll be part of it as well. And I mean, specific to the military, they've sent out lots of flags that don't call us, like we may not be available in this day and age, but that may change in the future too. But we're also looking at other parts of the world and where other resources may be hit. We're looking at hybrid agreements and what we're actually working with DFATE in Ottawa right now, and what we could do if we needed an interim agreement with a country that we don't normally deal with, that we don't have an agreement with. For instance, you know, if we wanted to go somewhere like South Africa and get firefighters, and how would we do that? And that would all be part of the plan as well. You know, the misconception is, and Peter, you know this very well, but others may not, is that, you know, we say, well, we've got a huge country south of us and they have all kinds of firefighter resources, but when we're busy, they tend to be busy. And so it was the same last year when Slave Lake was burning. The U.S. said, we really don't have anything to help. But we also need to, and as Brian Stocks pointed out, there are other ways to get U.S. resources. And so if the U.S. Forest Service says no to us, for instance, there may still be state resources that we need to access a different way. And so we're working on that strategy as well, and how we can get better use of those kinds of resources. Is that what you meant, Peter? Sure. Yeah.
Is sharing internationally effective and economic, or is it largely or partly politics and optics? Sharing with Greece and Portugal overseas, by the time you get your equipment there or they get theirs here, it's too late. There's been some suggestion about that in the past.
I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it's not cheap to move resources that far, but I mean, well-trained, commonly trained resources are useful. I mean, if they get here too late, obviously they're not, but I mean, if they get here on time and you can use them. Peter mentioned earlier, I mean, the province of British Columbia has, they have an agreement with the state of Victoria in Australia, and they've exchanged resources. Now, part of that is for familiarity and for training, but also its resources is boots on the ground, so to speak. And we have been requested in the past, you know, and we questioned it a year ago, Christmas, we were asked to send resources to Israel to help them. And we looked at it and we were prepared to send resources. There was 2 provinces responded, and we were preparing aircraft to fly to Israel. But at the end of the day, you know, what was that effectiveness? That's a fair enough question, because was their situation relevant? But Canadian, you know, there's such a strong fire history and knowledge in Canada. If one of the provinces or territories asks for resources from South Africa or Chile or wherever, then they know what they want and they'll know how to use them when they arrive. They won't be sitting idle. I think it's very different depending on the country you go into. Thank you.